Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Quest for Truth. Now, the other aspect of it that I talked about was pornography. You can say that, well, I'm not actually doing anything. We like to, as human beings, we like to draw lines that don't exist and then get as close to that line as we can. But Jesus puts that idea to rest in Matthew chapter 5, right after where we looked last week in verse 27 and 28. He says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery." There's the law that was given to the Jews that we looked at. "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And so everything that we looked at in Corinthians, Jesus is saying that is true of you, even when you don't have to touch her, you don't have to have sex with her, but when you look at her with lust, with the wanting to, with, you have already done so in your heart. And so again, morally, he's saying the line is not at the action, and we talked about this last week as well. The line is not with the action, but it's with the heart, the motive of the heart that precedes the action. And so when we look at what it means to not commit adultery, it means to not look at a woman with lust. And our culture has largely, in a lot of ways, built up this idea of, with casual sex, sex is just something to do. And in that regard, women largely just become, and men, the reverse is true as well. It just takes a little longer to get there. I think that it's just, you just become a throwaway. You just become an object. The objectification of women. Well, I think the same is true of men. It's just, like I said, taken a little longer to get here because of the makeup of women compared to men, I think. But you eventually get there. And so Jesus is saying here that in order to not commit adultery, in order to not have lust in your heart, we can kind of go back to Corinthians here, and we can say to be one with Christ is to not be one with others sinfully, outside of marriage. And so we have this idea that to remove yourself from the evils of this world, from adultery, from sex outside of marriage, from pornography, it looks like putting yourself into oneness with Christ, focusing on the idea that we are one with Christ. We are attached to him. We are the temple of God, temple of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is in us. And so we have him within us. And how this sin is a sin against our own body, against the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so that is why it's interesting, because it's hurtful to ourselves. It's wrong on many different areas, many different levels. It's morally wrong. It is sinning against God. It is going against his plan of marriage for humanity. One man and one woman become one flesh, and it's going against that. And then two, it's denigrating our society. It's putting holes in the family, eroding the the family and all of that brings to society, but it's also hurting the individual. When you begin by, becoming one with different people and then tearing away, you begin to lose pieces of yourself. Even when you're committing adultery just in your heart, you lose pieces of yourself. And so really, in I think more ways than a lot of the other commandments, this one here is really God seeking to protect us, to protect our hearts, and to protect us from ourselves, because we are, desperately wicked, and we do lust almost, naturally. That is the natural tendency. And so we need this command, we need this rule, this really should be a societal norm to keep us from this, because our flesh is driven towards it. And so because it's no longer a social norm, we see that society has focused on this, and we've seen that the fallout that brings with it. And so God really, though it's a moral law, of course, primarily, but we see God's heart for his creation to experience what God really has for his people, to experience the goodness of marriage and the goodness of a sexual relationship inside of marriage, and the keeping from that all of the bad that those adulterous relationships bring. I mean, there's so many examples. The Proverbs has a lot of wisdom about keeping away from adultery. You look at the life of David, you see the great tragedies that came about because of his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba. His family fell apart, his kingdom fell apart. It was kept through Solomon, but after Solomon it was tore apart, and that was just really the beginning of Israel's downfall. And not to say that David was alone there, but as the king, I mean, it's very clear that it was a large part of it, and his family, his children, the relationships that came about because of his sinful relationship with Bathsheba. And he was, in some sense, unable to deal with it because he knew that he didn't have, probably in some sense, the moral high ground to deal with it. And that's the idea, that when you're already dealing with, when you're at the bottom of something, when you're in deep, and when you're in a mud hole, you aren't in a position to help somebody out. And so I think David had this understanding that how can I deal with my children's relationships if I can't even handle my own? And so really, I think we owe it to ourselves and also to the next generation and the generations that follow to strive to keep this commandment, because it's important, and we know it's important. We looked at that. We looked in the Old Testament where God said, if you fail to keep this appointment, you shall die, be put to death. That's how important it is. But it's important because we are the temple of God. And to commit adultery is to violate that temple, to sin against God who is within us. And so I think this commandment here, thou shalt not commit adultery, is one of the most necessary for our society today, that we really need to break down a lot of societal norms and things that we have in our society today, and to be able to say, especially as Christians, like, we are not going to participate, just like in Corinth, we're not going to participate in the sins that are so common in society. We are going to be set apart. We are going to be holy before God, and not do what our culture does, not follow what our culture says is okay, not go along with them, but to follow what God says. And what God says is that we shall not commit adultery, and even lust is considered adultery in our hearts. And that's the heart motive that God is looking for. Well, thank you for coming along for this episode. I appreciate you watching and taking the time to come along with us, and I will see you again next week.